Hey guys, it's Rachel Worthy with a new episode of Greenhouse TV. This week we're talking about the morality of Thanos. We are continuing with our series on apologetics, and today we are asking if our moral sensibilities that we have as people is something that points us towards the existence of God. Why do we as humans have a moral sense? This is a question that philosophers, evolutionists, scientists, and theologians have been asking for generations. There's actually someone else who's been wrestling with this, and that is the ultimate bad guy of the Marvel Universe, Thanos. One of the things that makes Thanos a really interesting bad guy is that he seemed truly convinced that his vision for the world, to wipe out half of all living things, yikes, is moral. He believes it is the right thing to do to help the world. And I think this tells us something important about the universal nature of a sense of morality. Strange, I know, but we'll come back to it. Today we're going to be talking about how it appears that there's a moral law that is knit into our fabric as human beings that we can't seem to quite get away from. Now, the master of this form of argument for the Christian faith is Mr. C.S. Lewis, and we are going to read a paragraph out of the opening of his book because it frames up this question and this discussion for us really well. He writes this: "Everyone has heard people quarreling. Sometimes it sounds funny and sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant, but however it sounds, I believe we can learn something very important from listening to the kinds of things they say. They say things like this: how would you like it if anyone did the same to you? That's my seat, I was there first. Leave him alone, he isn't doing you any harm. Why should you shove in first? Come on, you promised." Now, what interests me about all these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He is appealing to some kind of standard of behavior which he expects the other man to know about. And the other man very seldom replies, "To hell with your standard." Nearly always, he tries to make out that what he has been doing does not really go against the standard, or that if it does, there is some special excuse. And I think C.S. Lewis makes a good point here. We all have a sense that there's a way that things should be. So let us look at some possibilities for what this moral sense, this urge that there is a way things should be done, is in us. Number one, maybe our moral sense is just an instinct or an urge. Now, we may have an urge or an instinct to shout at a baby or a toddler who has accidentally hurt us and hit us really hard, but very few of us would say that following through on that instinct would be moral. In fact, a lot of what is considered moral is restraining instincts and urges that we have. Things like not taking everything we want sexually, not shouting, not fighting, being generous even when it would be easier to be selfish. I think we can safely say that our moral sense is not just pure instinct. Okay, number two, maybe our moral sense is something that we are taught by culture. Now, in a sense, this is certainly true. When we are brought up as children, we are taught a moral sense from people around us. But something else we're taught by people around us when we're children is the multiplication table. Our culture didn't invent the multiplication table. It's something that is objectively true. And I believe that the fact that our culture teaches us something doesn't mean it's something that our culture has just made up. Perhaps morality is like the multiplication table. It's something objectively true that we learn by being in a cultural context. So I would argue that morality, even if it is something we're taught by our culture, that does not make it something that's not innate in us. Number three, maybe our moral sense is determined by what is pleasing or convenient to us. We're going to turn to the words of C.S. Lewis again. He said this: "I am not angry except perhaps for a moment before I come to my senses, with a man who trips me up by accident. I am angry with a man who tries to trip me up, even if he does not succeed. Yet the first has hurt me and the second has not. Sometimes the behavior which I call bad is not inconvenient to me at all, but the very opposite." It may be illogical, but if we look at ourselves, I think we find that this is true. Something being pleasing to us is not always something that we consider to be right. Okay, perhaps our moral sense is just a survival instinct. It is the result of evolution so that we don't get rejected by our community. But as I'm sure many of us know from biology class, the driving force of evolution is natural selection, survival of the fittest. Ethics, for the most part, is extremely concerned with those who are actually not the fittest: the poor, the outcast, the vulnerable, the young, the old. The people for whom it is not convenient or beneficial for you to care for and to care about. There's also a sense that our moral sense actually causes us to care for people outside of our tribe. We're not there just trying to make our community survive. This is the reason that racism is wrong, or why we care what's happening to children in other nations. It seems that we are haunted by this sense that we aren't what we should be, that others aren't what they should be, that our world isn't what it should be. And if we've never even seen this ideal, where do we get this idea from? Now, you may object and say that different places in the world have very different morals. And that is true. Let us return to Thanos. I think what's very interesting about Thanos is that Thanos doesn't want to destroy half of all life on Earth because he believes that there's no such thing as right or wrong, or because he wants to be rebellious and go against what he knows to be right. He wants to destroy life precisely because he believes it is the right and moral thing to do. Like everyone else, he appeals to a higher moral order in his argument. We would just disagree with his assessment on what is right and what is wrong. A universal moral sense doesn't mean we all agree on what is right and wrong. It means that there is a higher moral law, and we argue about what it means to live up to that. For example, there's been a really big shift in sexual morality since the 1960s. Things like homosexuality and sex before marriage have now become widely acceptable. But the moral argument isn't that there is no right or wrong when it comes to sexual ethics. The argument that people make is that we had these activities in the wrong category when they really should have been considered in the right category. People who argue for these things would almost certainly not argue that rape, pedophilia, or incest is acceptable. We may disagree over what the moral standard should be, but we can't get away from the fact that we are haunted by this moral ideal. Even some of the more interesting villains of our movies argue for a moral standard. It seems to me that there must be some force outside of us that directs us to this. It is not within us. We don't live up to it ourselves, and it can't be in our society because we don't see an ideal in our society. It seems that there is something or someone out there that wishes us to behave in a certain way, and we can't seem to shake ourselves of this idea. Now, that doesn't quite get us all the way to the Christian God. You still have a long philosophical route to get all the way there, for which I would recommend you read this fantastic book, Mere Christianity. But it certainly does emphasize the fact that a moral sense in all humans is an argument against a purely atheistic material world. I believe that God is that something outside of us that directs us continually towards a moral ideal. Join us next week as we continue with our series on apologetics.